Hey guys, tonight we're traveling through time and story to one of the most ancient and mystical corners of our world, a land where prophets walked, kingdoms rose, and faiths collided. We're talking about Israel, a place that has carried the weight of holiness for millennia. But how did this small strip of land, nestled between deserts and seas, become known as the Holy Land? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the type of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know from where you're watching and what time it is for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's uncover what we have for tonight together. Before the world called it Israel, before scriptures and empires claimed it as their own, this land was known by another name, Canaan. It was a place of hills and valleys, deserts and green plains, a thin strip of land stretching along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. To the casual eye, it may have looked like any other corner of the ancient Near East. But geography has a way of shaping destiny, and the destiny of this land would be unlike any other. The land that would one day be called the Holy Land sits at the very heart of the ancient world, a natural bridge connecting three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was a corridor of movement, trade, and conquest. Every major civilization, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from the Hittites to the Persians, brushed against it. To control this land was to control the gateway between worlds. Its geography is deceptively small, roughly the size of New Jersey in the United States, yet within its narrow borders lies a remarkable diversity of terrain. To the west, the coastal plains stretch along the Mediterranean, fertile and easy to settle. Moving inland, the land rises sharply into central highlands, rocky hills that form the spine of ancient Israel. Beyond these highlands, the earth drops again into the Great Rift Valley, where the Jordan River winds its slow path down to the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth's surface. To the east of that, the arid desert begins, stretching endlessly toward Arabia. This striking variation in landscape, fertile fields, mountains, deserts, and sea, made the region both a gift and a challenge. It could sustain life with abundance, yet it could also turn harsh and unforgiving in a single season. It was a place where survival depended on faith, resilience, and an intimate relationship with the land itself. And that relationship between people and soil, between heaven and earth, would come to define its spiritual identity. Long before any religion claimed it, ancient peoples had already settled these lands. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of Neolithic villages that date back over 10,000 years. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, lies in this very region. Its ancient walls, built and rebuilt across millennia, are silent witnesses to humanity's earliest attempts to create permanence in a world of impermanence. The early Canaanites who lived here were not a single nation, but a patchwork of city-states and tribes. Each city, Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, and many others, had its own king, its own gods, and its own customs. They worshipped a pantheon of deities, often tied to nature, gods of rain, fertility, and storm. The chief among them was El, and alongside him, Baal, the god of thunder and renewal. To the Canaanites, the land itself was alive, animated by divine presence. Mountains were sacred, springs were holy, every grove, every stone could be a dwelling of the gods. It's here that we begin to understand why this region became a crucible of faith. Unlike the broad, predictable Nile Valley of Egypt or the great rivers of Mesopotamia, Canaan was unpredictable. Rainfall was seasonal and uneven. Famine was a constant risk. The people of this land lived on the edge, and that uncertainty forged a spirituality that sought divine order in a world of chaos. The harshness of the land invited belief. The need for survival demanded faith. Trade routes cut through the land like veins. The Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, ran along the coast, connecting Egypt to Syria and beyond. The King's Highway wound through the eastern desert plateaus, linking Arabia to Damascus. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims moved along these paths, carrying not only goods, but ideas. And through this constant flow, the land became a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. This convergence gave rise to something extraordinary, a landscape where human experience and divine aspiration constantly intertwined. To the Egyptians, this land was a border, the frontier of their empire, where outposts and fortresses guarded against northern invaders. To the Mesopotamians, it was a distant shore of their trade ambitions. And to the Canaanites themselves, it was home, a living canvas painted by drought and harvest, by worship and war. The constant tension between great empires and small tribes turned the region into an eternal stage of struggle and renewal. Cities were built and destroyed, rebuilt and renamed, yet somehow the land never lost its centrality. As the Bronze Age progressed, the cultural map of Canaan evolved. Clay tablets discovered at Ugarit and other sites reveal the sophistication of Canaanite religion, literature, and trade. These people were storytellers, poets, and craftsmen. They recorded myths about gods descending to earth, dying and returning, fertility and drought, stories that would echo in later traditions. The seeds of monotheism, scholars suggest, may have sprouted in this fertile soil of myth and meaning. The rugged hills of Judea and Samaria, though less hospitable for agriculture than the coastal plains, offered protection. These highlands would later become the heartland of the Israelite tribes. The isolation of the mountains bred independence, while the closeness of the valleys fostered community. Villages clung to hillsides, where families worked terraced farms and gathered around communal wells. Life was simple, cyclical, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature. Geographically, Canaan was not just a crossroads, it was a threshold. It stood between the mighty civilizations that defined the ancient world. Yet it belonged fully to neither, and perhaps that is why it became the perfect setting for a faith that would transcend borders. In its soil, people dreamed of eternity because their earthly existence was fragile. In its storms, they sought meaning, and in its mountains, they imagined gods speaking from fire and cloud. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to see this land only through the lens of religion or politics. But long before those divisions, it was the geography itself that made it sacred. The very experience of living here, between fertility and famine, empire and wilderness, shaped how people saw the divine. The holiness of Israel did not begin with prophecy or conquest. It began with place. It began with the land's ability to hold opposites, abundance and barrenness, beauty and danger, chaos and creation. When ancient travelers reached its borders, they often described it as different from any other place. Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom mention journeys through Redyanu, their name for Canaan, speaking of its hills, forests, and strange gods. Mesopotamian tablets refer to Amuru, the land to the west, known for its hardy people and unpredictable weather. Every outsider recognized something distinct about this territory, a land both inviting and forbidding, blessed and burdened. And so, long before the Israelites arrived, before Jerusalem's stones were stacked into walls, and before prophets and kings claimed divine guidance, this land already carried a sense of sacred tension. It was where heaven felt near, not because of monuments or temples, but because of the land's raw intensity, its closeness to both life and death. When the first herders and settlers lifted their eyes to the rugged skyline of Canaan, they saw more than mountains. They saw symbols, altars of earth rising toward the sky. The seeds of holiness were already sown in their imagination, and those seeds would grow, generation after generation, until the world itself came to know this narrow strip of land as the Holy Land. When we move from the geography of the Holy Land to its earliest known stories, we step into a time shrouded in both mystery and legend, an age before empires, before writing shaped memory, when the lives of a few wandering families would change how humanity understood faith itself. This is the age of the patriarchs, the era of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, names that echo through three of the world's great religions, and whose journeys gave the land its first sense of divine purpose. To understand how Israel became the Holy Land, we must begin with Abraham, the man who heard a voice that others could not hear, a call that would turn a wandering shepherd into the father of nations. Abraham's story begins not in the land of Israel, but far to the east, in the city of Ur, one of Mesopotamia's great urban centers. Ur was a place of temples and trade, where ziggurats pierced the skyline, and the moon god, Nana, was worshipped. The world of Abraham's birth was already sophisticated, yet spiritually divided. Gods and idols filled the cities, each demanding loyalty. Into that world, the biblical account introduces something revolutionary, a single divine voice calling one man to leave everything he knew behind. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, the voice said, to the land that I will show you. That land, according to the story, was Canaan, the land we now know as Israel. And so began one of the most transformative migrations in human history, not of armies, but of faith. Abraham traveled westward, following the great rivers, the Euphrates, then across the Syrian wilderness, until he reached the land that the voice had promised. He built altars wherever he went, marking places where heaven seemed to meet earth. Archaeologists have long studied sites like Shechem, Bethel, and Hebron, places where the patriarchs are said to have dwelt. And even though physical proof of Abraham's journey remains elusive, the cultural memory of his passage has endured for nearly 4,000 years. The heart of Abraham's story is the covenant, a divine agreement that redefined the human relationship with God. In ancient times, covenants were political or familial pacts, oaths sealed with ritual. But this covenant was unlike any other. It bound a mortal and the divine in trust. God promised Abraham land, descendants, and blessing, and in return, Abraham promised faithfulness. The covenant turned geography into destiny. The land was no longer just territory, it became a sacred inheritance, a stage upon which humanity's relationship with the divine would unfold. Abraham's descendants, Isaac, the son of laughter, and Jacob, the one who wrestled with God, would inherit not only the promise, but also the struggles that came with it. Their lives, as preserved in the book of Genesis, are not tales of perfection, but of persistence. Isaac's quiet faith contrasted with Abraham's daring. Jacob's cunning and transformation mirrored the unpredictable nature of the land itself. Jacob, who would later be renamed Israel, meaning one who wrestles with God, embodied the character of the nation that would bear his name. His story is filled with journeys, dreams, and confrontations. He fled from his brother Esau, found love and hardship in distant lands, and returned with a new sense of purpose. His vision of a ladder reaching to heaven, the famous Jacob's ladder, symbolized something timeless, that the boundary between heaven and earth could be crossed not by power, but by faith. Jacob's 12 sons became the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. This idea that a family's lineage could form the foundation of a people is one of the most enduring concepts in human history. The tribes represented unity through diversity, separate yet connected, bound together by a shared promise and a shared land. The land of Canaan, once a patchwork of city-states and rival peoples, was now seen as divinely allocated, each tribe with its place, each generation with its calling. It's worth pausing here to consider what makes these stories so foundational. In historical terms, they describe the gradual movement of Semitic pastoralists through the Levant, people whose livelihood depended on herding and seasonal migration. But in spiritual terms, they tell of humanity's awakening, a shift from worshiping many gods of nature to believing in a single, invisible, moral God who made covenants with humans. The land of Canaan became the physical embodiment of that covenant, a visible reminder of an invisible promise. The age of the patriarchs also reflects a remarkable interplay between faith and geography. When famine struck, the patriarchs often left the land, seeking food in Egypt, but they always returned. This rhythm of exile and return became a central theme in the identity of Israel, a cycle that would repeat throughout history, from the Babylonian exile to the modern diaspora. The idea that holiness persists through displacement, that the promise of the land transcends even the loss of it, began with Abraham's footsteps. Each patriarch had a defining moment of encounter with the divine. For Abraham, it was the binding of Isaac, a story that still stirs awe and unease. On a mountain in Moriah, Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son, the very son through whom the covenant was to continue. At the last moment, God intervened, sparing the child and reaffirming the promise. The mountain, tradition holds, would later become the site of the temple in Jerusalem. Thus, the very heart of the Holy Land, the Temple Mount, traces its sanctity back to this act of faith and surrender. Isaac's life, though quieter, preserved the line. He dug wells in the desert, negotiated with neighboring tribes, and maintained peace, acts that symbolized continuity and endurance. His story shows that holiness is not always born from miracles or battles. Sometimes it is sustained by simple perseverance in difficult terrain. Jacob's story, on the other hand, is a journey of transformation. He deceives, flees, dreams, and returns changed. On the banks of the Jabbok River, he wrestles with a mysterious being, perhaps an angel, perhaps God himself, and emerges limping but blessed. That encounter left not just a scar, but a name, Israel. From then on, the land and the people shared one identity, both marked by struggle and divine touch. By the end of the patriarchal era, the family of Israel had grown, but their story was far from over. A famine once again drove them to Egypt, a temporary refuge that would turn into centuries of bondage. Yet even in foreign soil, the memory of the promise endured. They carried with them the stories of Abraham's altars, Isaac's wells, Jacob's ladder, reminders of a land where heaven had once spoken to humanity. The age of the patriarchs stands as the spiritual foundation of Israel's holiness. It was during this era that land, faith, and identity became inseparable. The patriarchs didn't build temples or cities, they built altars, simple stones that marked encounters between man and God. Their journeys carved meaning into geography, transforming Canaan from mere territory into sacred ground. In this age, the holiness of Israel was born not through conquest or law, but through covenant, a bond of faith that would echo across ages. And so, when people later called it the Holy Land, they were really naming a memory, the memory of men and women who looked at the same hills and valleys we see today and believed that somewhere in that soil, eternity touched the earth. When Jacob, now called Israel, settled in the land of Canaan, he was not just a man leading a family. He was the living link between a divine promise and a future people. His 12 sons would each become a root of that future, the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. These tribes, scattered across the hills, valleys, and deserts of the Promised Land, would form a unique kind of nation, one not built around empire or kingship, but around covenant and kinship. The story of the tribes begins in the heart of family life. Jacob's household was large and complicated, filled with love, rivalry, and prophecy. From his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and their handmaids, came 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Each son's birth came with a name that carried meaning, a reflection of the mother's hope, a prayer, or a moment of emotion. These names, simple as they were, became the foundations of the people who would later inhabit the Promised Land. The story of the 12 tribes is not only a family chronicle, it's a map of destiny. Each tribe was destined to inherit a specific portion of Canaan, a pattern that would later be described in meticulous detail in the book of Joshua. But before they could settle, they had to become a people, unified through struggle, purified through hardship. That process would take generations, and it would begin far from Canaan, in the crucible of Egypt. After Joseph, one of Jacob's youngest sons, was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, he eventually rose to power in Egypt. Through a combination of wisdom, faith, and foresight, Joseph became Pharaoh's trusted advisor, saving the nation from famine. When drought struck Canaan, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food, and in one of the most powerful reconciliations in ancient literature, they were reunited. Joseph invited them to settle in Egypt's fertile region of Goshen, where they prospered. But with time, new pharaohs arose who feared their growing strength, and the Israelites became enslaved. That period of bondage in Egypt transformed the descendants of Jacob from a family into a nation. Their shared suffering, their shared longing for freedom, forged an identity stronger than blood alone. The promise made to Abraham of land and blessing now took on renewed urgency. The people remembered it. Even in exile, they carried the memory of a homeland they had never seen, but believed to be theirs by divine right. Centuries later, under Moses' leadership, they would be freed from Egypt's chains and led across the wilderness in what became the defining journey of their faith, the Exodus. This 40-year passage through the desert was not simply geographic, it was spiritual. It turned a group of freed slaves into a covenant community bound by law and purpose. On Mount Sinai, they received the Ten Commandments, a moral code that would shape not only their lives, but much of the moral heritage of the world. The law gave structure to their faith, and the land remained its promise, the place where divine principles would take root in human society. When the Israelites finally reached the borders of Canaan after decades of wandering, they stood at the threshold of fulfillment. Under Joshua, Moses' successor, they crossed the Jordan River, a crossing that symbolized rebirth, leaving behind the wilderness and stepping into destiny. The conquest of Canaan, as described in biblical tradition, was not just a military campaign. It was portrayed as the reclaiming of a divine inheritance. Archaeological evidence suggests that this conquest may have been a gradual process, waves of settlement, small-scale conflicts, and assimilation, rather than a single sweeping invasion. Yet what mattered most to the people was not the method, but the meaning. Each battle, each settlement, was a reaffirmation that this land had been promised to them by God. The holiness of the land was not just in its soil, but in the covenant that bound it to the people. Once the land was secured, it was divided among the tribes. The process of division is one of the most fascinating aspects of Israel's early history. The territory was not distributed randomly, but through a ritual process that reflected both faith and fairness. According to the biblical account, Joshua cast lots before the Lord to determine which tribe would receive which region. This act symbolized that the land was not conquered property, but sacred trust, given, not taken. Each tribe received a portion suited to its needs and character. Judah, destined for leadership, received the vast and rugged territory of the south, including the city of Hebron, a land of vineyards and hills. Ephraim and Manasseh, the two tribes descended from Joseph, were granted fertile lands in the central highlands, regions rich in agriculture and trade routes. Benjamin received the small but strategically vital territory around Jerusalem. Zebulun and Issachar settled in the lush northern valleys, close to the Sea of Galilee, while Asher, Dan, and Naphtali held the coastal and northern frontier zones. Levi, the tribe of priests, was unique. Unlike the others, it received no territorial inheritance. Instead, The Levites were scattered throughout Israel, serving in religious duties and maintaining the spiritual heart of the nation. Their lack of land symbolized that their inheritance was not of earth but of service, a constant reminder that holiness was not tied solely to soil but to the sacred duties performed upon it. The distribution of land gave rise to a delicate balance, unity through diversity. Each tribe had its own identity, economy, and leadership, yet all shared one covenant and one God. This tribal system was not a monarchy. It was more like a federation of faith. The people were linked not by the rule of kings, but by the rule of law and the shared belief that their existence was divinely ordained. The early years of settlement were filled with challenges. The Canaanites still occupied parts of the land, and coexistence sometimes turned into conflict. Yet, over time, the Israelites established themselves as a distinct people. They built altars on mountains, sanctuaries in valleys, and towns surrounded by stone walls. The tabernacle, the portable sanctuary from their desert years, remained at the center of worship, reminding them of their journey and their dependence on the divine presence that guided them. Culturally, the 12 tribes became more than political entities. They became symbols of the human condition, each tribe representing different strengths, flaws, and destinies. Judah symbolized leadership and courage. Levi represented faith and service. Issachar, learning and wisdom. Zebulun, trade and expansion. Together, they reflected the multifaceted nature of a people chosen not for perfection, but for purpose. In time, these tribal territories would give way to a unified kingdom, but the memory of the tribes never disappeared. Even centuries later, when the nation faced exile and dispersion, the names of the tribes were invoked as a sign of unity and hope. The image of 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes, became a recurring symbol in religious art and scripture, a reminder of the foundation upon which the faith was built. The story of the 12 tribes is ultimately the story of belonging, of how a scattered family became a nation, how faith took root in soil, and how land became not just a place to live, but a promise to uphold. It is in this section of history that Israel's holiness becomes tangible, measured not just in divine words, but in boundaries, harvests, and homes. Here, faith and geography finally meet, and the Holy Land begins to take shape, not as myth, but as a living, breathing reality. The story of the Exodus is one of the most iconic and compelling chapters in the history of the Holy Land. It is a story not only of liberation, but of transformation, a journey that shaped the very identity of Israel and forged the connection between a people and the land they would one day call their own. To understand how Israel became the Holy Land, we must first understand this monumental journey, both in physical and spiritual terms. The Israelites, descendants of Jacob's 12 sons, had settled in Egypt during Joseph's rise to prominence. Egypt offered fertile soil, the Nile's predictable floods, and safety during famine. But prosperity and security came at a cost. Over generations, the Israelites grew in number, and the new Pharaoh, wary of their strength, enslaved them. They were pressed into labor, building cities and monuments that would immortalize Egyptian grandeur. Yet their own story remained unrecorded and unseen by the world. It is here, in a land of exile and oppression, that the divine narrative pivots. God, in the biblical account, calls Moses, a man raised in the palace of Pharaoh, yet born of Israelite heritage, to lead his people out of bondage. Moses' early life is marked by irony, saved from death as an infant, raised with the privileges of Egyptian royalty, yet intrinsically connected to the oppressed. His story bridges two worlds, just as the Israelites themselves occupy the liminal space between Egypt and Canaan. Moses' call at the burning bush is one of the most enduring images in religious history. Standing on holy ground, Moses is told that he will lead his people to the promised land. The command is both practical and profound. He must confront Pharaoh, demand freedom for his people, and trust that God will guide them. What begins as a mission to escape slavery becomes a journey of faith, identity, and covenant. The Exodus itself, as described in Scripture, is an extraordinary tale of miraculous intervention and human endurance. Pharaoh's repeated refusals lead to the plagues, extraordinary demonstrations of divine power that challenge the authority of Egypt's gods. Each plague, from the turning of the Nile's water to blood to the darkness that envelops the land, serves as a stark lesson. The God of Israel is not limited to one people or one place. He is a force intertwined with justice, morality, and destiny. When Pharaoh finally allows the Israelites to leave, the journey begins in earnest. They do not merely walk from Egypt to Canaan. They traverse a landscape that is harsh, unforgiving, and spiritually transformative. The desert becomes both a challenge and a classroom. Water is scarce, food is limited, and survival depends on faith and obedience. Yet the desert is also a space of revelation. It is in the wilderness that the Israelites receive the Torah, the law that will define their community and their relationship with God. The Ten Commandments, given at Mount Sinai, are not just rules. They are the blueprint for a civilization. They establish morality, justice, and responsibility, connecting the people to the land and to each other in ways deeper than mere territory. The Israelites' 40-year journey through the wilderness is rich with symbolism. Time in the desert is a period of testing, purification, and preparation. Generations are transformed, old doubts are shed, and a new society emerges. One organized not only by family and tribe, but by law, ritual, and communal responsibility. This period teaches that the land of Canaan is not simply to be conquered or inhabited, it is a sacred inheritance, one that demands respect, obedience, and moral vigilance. When the Israelites finally reach the borders of Canaan, the narrative shifts from wandering to conquest. The crossing of the Jordan River is depicted as a miraculous moment of divine intervention. The waters part, allowing the people to step into the land that had been promised centuries before. Every step in Canaan is a fulfillment of covenant. Each city, hill, and valley carries the weight of history and divine promise. The conquest itself is complex. Archaeological evidence suggests that rather than a single sweeping military campaign, the settlement of Canaan may have involved gradual migration, assimilation, and selective conflict. Yet the biblical narrative emphasizes divine mandate. The Israelites are not merely settlers, but inheritors of sacred promise. The land becomes a living testament to faith and obedience, a tangible proof that covenantal promises have materialized. Once in Canaan, the Israelites face the challenge of division and governance. The tribes must organize themselves, allocate territories, and defend against hostile neighbors. Each tribe receives a portion of the land, reinforcing the connection between geography and divine promise. The land is both inheritance and responsibility. Judah in the south, Ephraim and Manasseh in the central highlands, Benjamin around Jerusalem. Every territory holds strategic, agricultural, and spiritual significance. The distribution reinforces unity through diversity, linking each tribe to the land and to the covenant. The Exodus and the subsequent settlement also embed rituals and memory into the land. Altars are erected, sacred wells are dug, and festivals like Passover are established to commemorate the journey from slavery to freedom. These acts transform geography into narrative. Every mountain, river, and plain becomes a marker of divine interaction and human endurance. The Holy Land, in this sense, is not just physical soil, but a landscape imbued with stories, law, and faith. The return to the land is not merely a fulfillment of prophecy, it is the foundation of identity. The Israelites now see themselves as a people bound to a territory, a faith, and a history. Canaan is no longer just a destination, it is a covenantal home. The experience of exile, wandering, and return creates a consciousness that ties holiness to the land itself. The promised land is sacred not only because of divine mandate, but because it embodies struggle, faith, and continuity. Even after the initial settlement, the memory of the desert journey shapes Israelite culture. Generations are reminded of dependence, obedience, and moral responsibility. The wilderness experience becomes a metaphor for human life, trials, uncertainties, and the need for faith, while the land of Canaan represents reward, inheritance, and divine presence. Together, they define a worldview that continues to influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Exodus and return set the pattern for all future interactions with the land. Exile and homecoming, challenge and promise, obedience and blessing. These themes recur across centuries of Israelite history. From the Babylonian exile to modern migrations, the connection between people and land remains both spiritual and practical. The Holy Land is holy precisely because it has been the site of human struggle guided by divine promise. In sum, the Exodus is more than liberation from Egypt. It is the moment when faith, law, and land converge. It transforms a wandering people into a covenantal community and turns a disputed territory into a promised land. Every river crossed, every mountain scaled, every challenge overcome adds a layer of meaning to the soil of Israel. This is why, centuries later, the land would be revered, fought over, and cherished by countless generations. The Exodus and return teach us that the holiness of Israel is not accidental. It is forged through experience, hardship, obedience, and memory, and rooted in a covenant that links people to place. The land is sacred because it witnesses human courage and divine presence, because it contains stories of liberation and return, and because it stands as a testament to the enduring power of promise. After the Israelites had crossed the Jordan and settled in the Promised Land, their story entered a new and complex phase. No longer wandering nomads or enslaved migrants, they became a people of villages, towns, and tribal territories. Yet, establishing a cohesive society in a land that was already inhabited by other peoples posed immense challenges. The period that followed is known as the time of the Judges, a transitional era rich with lessons about leadership, faith, and the evolving relationship between the Israelites and their land. The term judges might be misleading to a modern audience. These leaders were not merely legal authorities, they were charismatic, often temporary figures who emerged during crises, military, political, or spiritual. They were chosen by God to guide the people, deliver them from enemies, and restore order when chaos threatened. In the tribal and decentralized structure of early Israel, a judge was more than a ruler. He or she was a moral and spiritual anchor for a society struggling to define itself. This period was marked by cycles of struggle and renewal. The Israelites would turn away from their covenantal obligations, adopting the religious practices of surrounding Canaanite populations. In response, they would face oppression from neighboring nations, Philistines, Moabites, Midianites, and others. In their desperation, the people would cry out to God, who would raise a judge to lead them to victory. Peace would follow, only for the cycle to repeat. This pattern of rebellion, punishment, repentance, and deliverance became emblematic of Israelite identity. It taught that holiness was maintained not by mere presence in the land, but through obedience, faith, and communal responsibility. One of the most famous judges, Deborah, stands out not only for her leadership, but for the extraordinary context in which she governed. In a patriarchal society, Deborah emerged as a prophetess and military leader, guiding Israel against Canaanite forces. Her story illustrates the intertwining of spiritual authority and practical leadership, the recognition that guiding a people requires both divine insight and strategic action. Other judges, such as Gideon, Samson, and Jephthah, demonstrate the diversity of leadership styles, from military genius to moral complexity. Each judge reflects the challenges of leading a society that was still discovering its identity in a contested land. The period of the judges also illuminates the social and religious structure of early Israel. Villages and tribal territories functioned autonomously, but the shared worship of God and adherence to the law formed a cultural and spiritual glue. The judges were essentially a temporary mechanism, stepping in when the delicate balance of tribal autonomy and communal responsibility faltered. Their stories, preserved in Scripture, read like parables of governance, the dangers of hubris, the consequences of disunity, and the power of faith-guided leadership. Despite the apparent disorder, the era of the judges was crucial in solidifying the Israelites' connection to the land. Unlike other peoples who consolidated power in cities, Israel's tribal system was rooted in territory, hills, valleys, and rivers that each tribe claimed as its inheritance. This deep connection to land reinforced the idea that Canaan was not simply property, but sacred ground entrusted to them by God. Fighting to defend or reclaim that land was not just an act of survival, it was an expression of fidelity to the covenant. Eventually, the limitations of the tribal system became apparent. The repeated cycles of crisis revealed the need for a more centralized form of governance. The people desired a king, a figure who could unify the tribes, coordinate defense, and provide stability. This request, though pragmatic, was met with hesitation by the prophet Samuel. In his view, asking for a king represented a subtle shift from reliance on divine guidance to dependence on human authority. Yet, God permitted it, setting the stage for the rise of monarchy in Israel. Saul became the first king of Israel, chosen for his stature, charisma, and initial military successes. He symbolized the union of tribal territories under a single authority. Saul's reign, however, was complicated by personal struggles, political pressures, and his imperfect relationship with God. His story demonstrates the tension inherent in monarchy, the need for unity and leadership balanced against human fallibility, and the challenges of governing a people bound to both law and faith. Following Saul, David rose to power, a figure whose impact on Israel's identity cannot be overstated. A shepherd boy, musician, and military strategist, David united the tribes in a way that no leader had before. He captured Jerusalem and established it as the political and spiritual capital of the nation. By doing so, he cemented the idea that the land and leadership were inseparable, that the Holy Land was defined not only by its covenantal promise, but also by its central place in the life of the people. Under David, the notion of a united Israel became both political reality and spiritual ideal. Solomon, David's son, further solidified this connection through the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. Unlike altars in the wilderness or hilltop sanctuaries, the temple was a permanent structure designed to house the Ark of the Covenant, the tangible manifestation of God's presence on earth. With its completion, Jerusalem became the heart of the nation and the symbol of holiness. Pilgrims and citizens alike recognized that Israel's identity was now geographically anchored. Holiness, law, leadership, and culture converged in one central location. The monarchy brought numerous advantages: stability, coordinated defense, administrative order, and a tangible sense of national identity. Yet it also introduced new challenges. Kings were human, subject to ambition, greed, and error. The centralization of power sometimes created tensions between the crown and the tribes, or between political authority and spiritual fidelity. The history of the judges and early monarchy illustrates a delicate balance. The Israelites' identity was always dual, a combination of faithfulness to God and practical governance in the land they were entrusted to inhabit. Culturally, this period is also marked by the codification of laws, establishment of festivals, and development of liturgical traditions. Each tribe, each settlement, and eventually the nation as a whole participated in a shared rhythm of worship and communal life. Feasts, sacrifices, and rituals reinforced the connection between the people, their God, and the land itself. The landscape was more than physical territory. It was a spiritual canvas on which history, law, and devotion were inscribed. By the end of the early monarchy, Israel had evolved from a scattered tribal society to a nation with a strong sense of divine purpose and territorial identity. The combination of leadership under the judges and kings, the establishment of a central temple, and the ongoing connection to tribal lands created a framework for Israel's enduring relationship with the Holy Land. It was no longer merely a promise, It had become a lived reality, a land where faith, governance, and culture intersected. The era of judges and kingdoms teaches us that holiness is not static. It is maintained through leadership, faithfulness, and the continual balancing of human action with divine guidance. The tribe's connection to their inherited lands, the unifying role of the monarchy, and the centrality of Jerusalem together illustrate how Israel's identity was anchored in both people and place. In this period, the Holy Land became more than a geographic promise. It became a nation's heartbeat, a land intertwined with law, culture, faith, and destiny. The hills, valleys, and cities of Israel were now sacred, not just by divine command, but because they were the stages on which generations of leaders, judges, and citizens enacted their covenant with God. It is in this delicate interplay of governance, tribal life, and spirituality that Israel's identity and its holiness was truly forged. The construction of Solomon's Temple marks one of the most pivotal moments in the history of Israel and the Holy Land. Unlike the transient altars of the Patriarchs or the portable tabernacle of the wilderness, the temple was permanent, monumental, and designed to embody the very presence of God. It transformed not only Jerusalem, but also the spiritual, cultural, and political identity of the Israelite people. To understand Israel's holiness, one must first understand the temple, its architecture, symbolism, and role in daily life. Solomon, son of David, inherited a kingdom that was politically united but spiritually restless. His father, David, had captured Jerusalem and made it the political capital of Israel, but the sacred center of worship still existed in a movable tabernacle. David's vision was clear: to build a permanent house for the Ark of the Covenant, the chest that held the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, the tangible symbol of God's covenant with Israel. Solomon's reign would realize that vision, creating a structure that would become the heart of the Holy Land. The temple's construction was an extraordinary feat of ancient engineering and artistry. According to biblical descriptions and archaeological research, it was built on the elevated platform of Mount Moriah, a site already associated with Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, a place where divine encounter had first been dramatized. The choice of location was deliberate. The temple would occupy the symbolic center of Israel, uniting the spiritual and political domains of the nation. Its centrality in Jerusalem mirrored its centrality in the people's religious imagination. Solomon employed thousands of laborers, artisans, and craftsmen. Cedar and cypress wood from Lebanon were imported. Quarried stones were precisely cut, and the interior was adorned with gold, silver, and intricate carvings depicting cherubim, palm trees, and floral motifs. The temple's architecture was divided into successive spaces, each with increasing sanctity: the outer courtyard, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. Access was strictly regulated. Only priests could enter the holy place, and only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. And then only once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This architectural hierarchy underscored the profound separation between the divine and human, while simultaneously offering a tangible connection between them. At the heart of the temple rested the Ark of the Covenant, symbolizing God's direct presence. This was no ordinary artifact. It was the embodiment of the covenant itself. The ark was a chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold, featuring two cherubim whose wings spread across its top. It represented God's throne on earth, a bridge between heaven and the mortal realm. In the religious imagination of the Israelites, it was as though God had chosen a dwelling, making the temple a portal where the divine could meet the human. The temple was not merely symbolic, it functioned as the center of ritual, law, and daily life. Every major festival, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, revolved around it. Pilgrims from across Israel traveled to offer sacrifices and participate in communal worship. The temple priesthood, particularly the Levites, maintained these rituals, ensuring that the covenantal practices established in the wilderness were faithfully carried out. Through these rituals, the land itself became sacred. Each harvest, each flock, each offering reinforced the people's relationship with God and their inherited land. The significance of the temple also extended to politics. By centralizing worship in Jerusalem, Solomon strengthened the unity of the nation. Previously, altars were scattered across hills and tribal territories. While those altars symbolized intimacy and immediacy with the divine, they were decentralized and could foster disunity or localized rebellion. The temple offered a focal point, a spiritual capital that mirrored Jerusalem's political authority. Holiness and governance were intertwined. The temple was as much a statement of divine order as it was a monument to architectural brilliance. Yet, the temple's role was not static. It evolved over time, reflecting Israel's changing circumstances. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah critiqued the people for relying solely on the temple's presence while neglecting justice, morality, and ethical conduct. Their warnings highlight a fundamental principle. Holiness was not merely in stone or gold, it was embodied in the behavior of the people. The temple magnified Israel's spiritual responsibility. To live in the Holy Land was to uphold both law and conscience. The temple also became a focal point for the wider ancient world. Neighboring kingdoms recognized its grandeur and the centrality of its religious authority. Pilgrims from distant lands came to witness, trade, and occasionally participate in festivals. The temple elevated Jerusalem from a regional city to an international symbol of sanctity, law, and cultural sophistication. Its influence resonated beyond Israel, shaping perceptions of divine authority and sacred space across the Near East. Tragically, the temple's history was also marked by destruction. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and exiled the people of Judah. Yet even in destruction, the temple's legacy persisted. Its memory became a symbol of hope, identity, and the enduring promise of the land. Prophets assured the people that God's presence could not be eradicated and that one day the temple would be rebuilt, restoring Israel's spiritual and national heart. Centuries later, this prophecy was realized with the construction of the Second Temple under Persian sponsorship. Though smaller and less ornate initially, the Second Temple reaffirmed Jerusalem's sacred role. Over time, leaders like Herod the Great would expand and enhance it, echoing Solomon's vision and reaffirming the centrality of the temple in the life of the Holy Land. Its continued presence shaped the religious imagination of Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. The temple's importance is not limited to historical or architectural significance. It represents a conceptual breakthrough in human consciousness, the idea that a people a law, and a land could converge in a single sacred place. The temple transformed the landscape into more than territory. It made it a stage upon which covenant, ritual, governance, and divine presence intersected. In short, it codified holiness in a physical, tangible form. The lessons of the temple endure. Even after its destruction, the site remains the most sacred location in Judaism, known today as the Temple Mount. Its sanctity reverberates through millennia, shaping pilgrimage, prayer, and cultural memory. It symbolizes the deep and inseparable connection between the people of Israel, their faith, and their land. Holiness, in this context, is as much about devotion, law, and communal life as it is about geography. In the end, the construction of Solomon's temple represents a turning point in the story of the Holy Land. The land is holy not only because of divine promise or historical inheritance, but because it contains a structure that embodies the meeting of heaven and earth, law and worship, people and God. It anchors Israel in the physical world, providing a locus for faith, culture, and identity. Through the temple, the Holy Land became more than land. It became a center of civilization, spirituality, and enduring human aspiration, a place where people could look toward the divine while walking on the very soil promised to their ancestors. The temple teaches us that holiness is not abstract. It is lived, enacted, and constantly renewed through human participation and divine presence. After Solomon's reign, Israel experienced a dramatic turning point, one that would shape the land's spiritual and political destiny for centuries. The kingdom that David had united and Solomon had ruled in glory could not withstand internal pressures and external challenges. Following Solomon's death, the nation split into two distinct kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division would introduce both conflict and reflection, testing the covenantal relationship between the people and the Holy Land. The split was driven by a combination of political, economic, and tribal factors. Solomon's rule, while strong, imposed heavy taxes and labor demands to support monumental projects like the temple and royal palaces. Discontent simmered among northern tribes, especially those who felt marginalized by the central authority in Jerusalem. When Solomon's son Rehoboam ascended the throne, he rejected the counsel of elder advisors to ease these burdens and instead followed the advice of younger courtiers to increase the demands on the people. This decision led to revolt. 10 tribes seceded, forming the northern kingdom of Israel under King Jeroboam, while Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam in the south. The division had profound consequences. Politically, the two kingdoms often found themselves at odds, vulnerable to external threats from Assyria, Egypt, and neighboring states. Religiously, it challenged the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. Jeroboam, fearing that pilgrimages to the temple would weaken his authority, established alternative worship centers in Bethel and Dan, complete with golden calves as symbols of divine presence. This move, while pragmatic, had lasting spiritual ramifications. It underscored the delicate tension between geography, governance, and holiness. The sacred land remained central to faith, but human ambition could distort its meaning. Both kingdoms faced persistent challenges from surrounding empires. The northern kingdom, larger and more populous, struggled with internal cohesion. Political instability led to frequent coups and dynastic changes, weakening its ability to resist external pressures. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquered Israel, scattering its population and bringing an abrupt end to the northern kingdom. This event, often called the Exile of the 10 Lost Tribes, illustrates the vulnerability of a nation bound to land yet divided by internal conflict. Even in displacement, however, the memory of the land persisted, a spiritual anchor for a people without territory. The southern kingdom of Judah fared somewhat better, maintaining Jerusalem as its capital and the temple as its spiritual heart. Yet Judah, too, was not immune to conquest. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, under King Nebuchadnezzar, captured Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and exiled the population to Babylon. This calamity marked a profound rupture. The center of Israel's spiritual and political life had been obliterated, leaving the people in a foreign land. For many, it seemed as though the promise of the Holy Land had been shattered. Yet, the Babylonian exile also became a period of reflection, codification, and spiritual deepening. Removed from the land that had defined their identity, the Israelites began to focus on preserving their culture, law, and faith in new ways. Scholars and prophets emphasized that holiness was not tied solely to geography, but to covenantal faithfulness. In texts composed or refined during this period, such as parts of the Torah and the prophetic writings, the exiles were reminded that God's presence transcended borders, even as the land itself remained divinely significant. The land of Israel was still sacred, even when uninhabited by its chosen people. The exile also fostered a profound connection to memory and hope. Rituals, festivals, and prayers emphasized the promise of return. Psalms and prophetic writings repeatedly express longing for Zion, Jerusalem, portraying it not just as a city, but as a symbol of divine presence, justice, and human destiny. The idea of returning to the land became central to Israelite identity. Even centuries later, Jewish communities around the world would maintain prayers and yearnings for the Holy Land, demonstrating that geography and faith are inseparably intertwined. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the exiled Israelites were granted permission to return to Judah. Led by figures such as Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the people rebuilt Jerusalem, re-established the temple, the Second Temple, and restored some measure of self-governance. This period marked a remarkable resurgence. The land, once lost, was reclaimed. The spiritual center, once destroyed, was renewed. Yet, the memory of division, conquest, and exile continued to shape the religious imagination, embedding a cautionary principle. Holiness requires fidelity, unity, and moral integrity. The division and fall of the kingdoms also illustrate the interplay between politics and spirituality. Human ambition, tribal tensions, and mismanagement led to fragmentation, which in turn exposed the people to foreign domination. Yet these political failures became moral and theological lessons. The land's sanctity was not annulled by conquest. Rather, it highlighted the covenantal responsibility of the people. To live in the Holy Land was to uphold justice, obedience, and ethical governance, lessons reinforced by prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Moreover, These events created enduring archetypes of exile and return that resonate throughout history. The northern tribes' disappearance, Judah's Babylonian exile, and subsequent restoration illustrate a recurring theme. The relationship between people and the land is dynamic, tested by human frailty and historical circumstance, yet resilient due to faith, memory, and promise. The land itself retains its holiness, even when its inhabitants falter or depart. It is both prize and teacher, reward and challenge. The narrative of division and fall also set the stage for later cultural and religious developments. The experiences of exile led to the compilation of sacred texts, the codification of law, and the centralization of prophetic authority. Worship became less dependent on temple rituals alone and more intertwined with study, prayer, and ethical conduct. In this sense, the Holy Land was not just physical soil, but a conceptual space where divine law, covenantal memory, and human aspiration converged. In conclusion, the division and fall of the Israelite kingdoms were both catastrophic and formative. Politically, they illustrate the dangers of fragmentation and human error. Spiritually, they underscore the resilience of faith and the enduring sanctity of the land. The exiles taught that holiness does not vanish with conquest, and the promise of return and the sacredness of the land persists across generations. The Holy Land, scarred but unbroken, continued to be the anchor of identity, covenant, and hope for the Israelites. In this period, we see clearly that the sanctity of Israel is inseparable from its history, its trials, triumphs, failures, and recoveries. The land's holiness is constantly reaffirmed through human experience, prophetic guidance, and the enduring connection between people and place. Division, conquest, and exile are not the end. They are chapters in the story of a land whose sacredness is tested, preserved, and ultimately reaffirmed through human perseverance and divine promise. The fall of Babylon and the rise of the Persian Empire in the 6th century BCE marked a transformative moment for the Israelites. After decades of exile, the Persian king Cyrus the Great issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to their ancestral land. This event, recorded in the Book of Ezra and recognized in historical records, was not merely a political gesture. It was a moment of spiritual resurgence, reaffirming the enduring holiness of the land and the covenantal bond between the Israelites and their promised land. The return was neither immediate nor uniform. Groups of exiles arrived in waves, bringing with them memories of Babylon, the trauma of displacement, and a longing for renewal. Leaders such as Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and the priests Joshua and Ezra played crucial roles in re-establishing governance, religious practice, and communal identity. Their efforts were both administrative and deeply symbolic, restoring the temple, purifying the community, and rekindling the sense that the land itself was sacred. One of the most significant undertakings was the rebuilding of the temple, the Second Temple, on the same site as Solomon's original sanctuary. This was a profound act of continuity and restoration. The temple, although initially more modest than Solomon's architectural masterpiece, symbolized the enduring presence of God in the land. Its reconstruction required not only labor and materials, but also careful negotiation with surrounding peoples and Persian authorities. Every stone laid Every altar erected and every ritual reinstated reinforced the message that the Holy Land remained central to Israel's identity. The Second Temple also marked a shift in the religious life of the people. Unlike the First Temple, which was associated with the grandeur of kingship, the Second Temple period emphasized priestly authority, communal worship, and the study of the Torah. Religious leaders, such as Ezra and Nehemiah, championed reforms to ensure that the covenantal laws were observed. Festivals were celebrated properly, and intermarriage with foreign populations was regulated to maintain cultural and spiritual integrity. Through these measures, holiness was not just a matter of physical presence in the land, but of faithful practice and communal cohesion. The geography of Jerusalem and its surroundings also regained spiritual significance during this period. The Temple Mount, once again the center of worship, became the axis around which the city and community were organized. Pilgrimages resumed, drawing worshippers from distant lands. The festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot were celebrated with renewed intensity, each act of ritual and devotion reinforcing the sacredness of the soil, the mountains, and the rivers of Judah. The land was not passive, it was a participant in the spiritual renewal, a stage where history, faith, and culture intersected. The Persian return also reinvigorated the connection between the Israelites and the prophetic tradition. Prophets such as Haggai and Zechariah exhorted the people to complete the temple, promising that God's glory would once again fill it. Their writings emphasize that divine presence is not confined to grandeur alone. It is realized through communal dedication, obedience, and the faithful enactment of law. The land of Israel, though scarred by exile and conquest, remained a living witness to covenantal fidelity. This period also saw the codification of sacred texts, an essential step in preserving cultural and religious memory. The Torah, historical records, and prophetic writings were edited, collected, and transmitted to ensure that future generations would retain an unbroken connection to their identity, their faith, and their land. This textual preservation was a spiritual lifeline during times of dispersion and reinforced the notion that holiness is maintained through memory, study, and devotion as much as through physical presence. Economically and socially, the Persian period reshaped the land as well. Agriculture was revived, trade routes reopened, and towns and villages were resettled. The relationship between the people and the land deepened as they tilled fields, maintained water systems, and restored settlements. In essence, the physical labor of returning and rebuilding became intertwined with spiritual restoration. Holiness was enacted not just in prayer and ritual, but through the reclamation and stewardship of the land itself. The Persian policies also provided a unique form of protection and autonomy by recognizing the Jews as a distinct community with religious freedom. The empire allowed them to rebuild their identity without constant interference. This period of relative peace enabled the consolidation of cultural, religious, and geographic cohesion. The people could once again link their covenantal identity directly to the land, living on, cultivating, and worshiping in the soil that had been promised to their ancestors. Yet the Second Temple period was not without challenges. The returning exiles encountered opposition from local populations who had settled during their absence. Tensions arose over governance, resources, and cultural practices. Leaders such as Nehemiah, who oversaw the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, had to navigate both spiritual and political complexities. These struggles illustrate a recurring theme in the history of the Holy Land: the interdependence of faith, land, and governance. Holiness was never passive. It required effort, vigilance, and moral responsibility. The enduring significance of the Persian return lies in its demonstration of resilience. Despite decades of exile and the destruction of the First Temple, the Israelites returned to the land and re-established Jerusalem as the spiritual heart of their identity. The Second Temple became a living symbol of continuity, showing that even after devastation, holiness and covenantal promise could be restored. This period reaffirmed a central lesson: the sanctity of Israel is inseparable from its people, their faith, and their relationship to the land. Moreover, the Second Temple set the stage for subsequent historical developments. It would become the center of religious life during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, witness to both cultural flourishing and political upheaval. It shaped the spiritual imagination of generations, influencing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The land of Israel, anchored by the temple, continued to serve as a tangible focal point for worship, identity, and hope, a reminder that even in exile or adversity, sacred geography maintains its significance. In conclusion, the Persian return and the rebuilding of the Second Temple represent both physical and spiritual restoration. The Holy Land was reclaimed, but more importantly, its sanctity was renewed through worship, law, labor, and community. The people reconnected with their ancestral soil, reaffirming the covenant that linked them to the land across centuries. Holiness was not merely inherited, it was actively nurtured, enacted, and remembered. Through the Second Temple, the Holy Land emerged as a living testament to resilience, faith, and divine promise, a land where human devotion and divine presence intersect, and where the past, present, and future converge in the enduring story of Israel. Following the Persian period, the land of Israel experienced another profound transformation under the Hellenistic empires that swept across the Near East after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. For the Israelites, this era was a time of cultural challenge, intellectual stimulation, and political tension. Understanding this period is crucial to comprehending how the Holy Land's identity evolved, blending ancient covenantal traditions with the realities of a changing world. Alexander the Great's conquests brought the entire Eastern Mediterranean under Hellenistic influence, and after his death in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his generals. Israel came under the control of the Ptolemies of Egypt and later the Seleucids of Syria. Hellenistic rule introduced new administrative systems, cities, and cultural practices, including Greek language, philosophy, and art. Greek became the lingua franca. Trade expanded across the Mediterranean, and urban centers grew in sophistication. For the Israelites, this presented both opportunities and threats, a chance to engage with the wider world while preserving distinct religious and cultural identity. One of the most significant impacts of Hellenization was on religious practice. Greek culture promoted polytheism, civic rituals, and philosophical inquiry. For many Jews, particularly in urban areas like Alexandria. Exposure to Greek ideas led to a blending of thought. Jewish theology encountered Greek philosophy, ethics, and governance. This interaction produced intellectual achievements such as the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which made sacred texts accessible to a broader audience and preserved them for posterity. Yet this also created tensions within the community between those embracing Hellenistic culture and those committed to traditional Torah observance. Politically, Hellenistic rule imposed new pressures. The Seleucid rulers, in particular, sought to consolidate power by imposing uniformity, including Greek religious and civic practices. Tensions escalated under rulers like Antiochus IV Epiphanes, whose aggressive policies attempted to suppress Jewish worship, desecrate the temple, and enforce Hellenistic customs. These actions sparked profound resistance as they threatened both the spiritual life of the community and the sanctity of the Holy Land itself. The land was not just territory, it was sacred ground, intimately tied to covenantal faith, and the imposition of foreign culture challenged the core of Israelite identity. This period of tension gave rise to one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the Holy Land, the Maccabean Revolt. A priestly family from the town of Modian, led by Mattathias and his sons, initiated an armed rebellion against Seleucid authority. Their struggle was not only a fight for political independence, but a defense of religious freedom and the sanctity of the temple in Jerusalem. The revolt lasted several years, marked by guerrilla warfare, strategic alliances, and remarkable acts of faith and courage. In 164 BCE, the Maccabees succeeded in reclaiming the temple, purifying it, and rededicating it, an event commemorated annually as Hanukkah. This restoration reaffirmed the enduring holiness of the land and the resilience of its people, showing that the Holy Land was inseparable from both faith and cultural identity. Culturally, the Hellenistic period also encouraged intellectual and artistic growth. Cities such as Sepphoris and Jerusalem became centers of learning, where architecture, mosaics, coinage, and literature reflected a fusion of Jewish and Greek traditions. Synagogues emerged as focal points of community life, serving as spaces for study, prayer, and civic engagement. The land itself became a canvas where human creativity intersected with religious devotion. Greek influence reshaped urban life and public structures, yet the spiritual essence of Israelite identity persisted, emphasizing obedience, law, and sacred memory. The Hellenistic period also had a profound effect on the interpretation and practice of Judaism. Philosophical inquiry, textual study, and debates over tradition versus innovation flourished. Groups such as the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes emerged, each interpreting the covenant, law, and land in ways that reflected differing responses to external influence. The Pharisees emphasized oral tradition and ethical conduct. The Sadducees maintained temple authority and ritual purity. The Essenes pursued ascetic life and spiritual separatism. Each group, in its own way, grappled with the question of how to remain faithful to God while engaging with the wider Hellenistic world. Economically, the land of Israel under Hellenistic rule experienced both growth and inequality. Trade expanded through coastal cities, Agricultural production increased in fertile regions, and local governance adapted to Hellenistic administrative structures. Yet, heavy taxation and political corruption fueled discontent in rural areas. This dynamic reinforced the idea that the sanctity of the land was tied to justice, stewardship, and ethical governance, principles emphasized repeatedly by prophets and leaders throughout Israelite history. Holiness was not abstract, it required engagement with the practical realities of life in the land. Religiously, the Hellenistic period deepened the symbolic significance of the Holy Land. The temple remained central, serving as a locus of identity, worship, and resistance. Sacred festivals, sacrifices, and pilgrimages reinforced the connection between people, faith, and land. At the same time, the challenges posed by foreign culture encouraged new forms of reflection, interpretation, and ritual innovation. The land was not simply soil or territory, it was a stage on which faith, resilience, and cultural continuity were enacted and preserved. The enduring lesson of this period is clear. The Holy Land's sanctity is constantly tested by cultural, political, and social forces. Yet the land's holiness persists because it is anchored in covenantal memory, communal practice, and spiritual devotion. Hellenistic influence expanded horizons, introduced challenges, and provoked debates, but it also reinforced the importance of identity, law, and sacred geography. The Israelites learned that holiness is not preserved passively, it requires engagement, courage, and adaptability. By the end of the Hellenistic era, Israel had emerged with a strengthened sense of its unique place in the world. The Maccabean victories, cultural innovations, and ongoing dedication to the temple reaffirmed that the land was more than territory. It was sacred history, inhabited by people committed to faith, covenant, and continuity. The Holy Land had endured conquest, exile, and cultural pressure, and its spiritual essence had only deepened through these trials. In conclusion, the Hellenistic period illustrates the dynamic relationship between Israel, its faith, and its land. Cultural influence, political pressure, and intellectual expansion challenged the people to define what it meant to be faithful in a changing world. The land remained central to identity and holiness, a space where resilience, ritual, and covenantal memory converged. Hellenistic Israel shows us that the sacredness of the Holy Land is not static, it is lived, defended, and continually reaffirmed across centuries of history. By the 1st century BCE, the world around the Holy Land had shifted once again. The great Hellenistic empires that once dominated the eastern Mediterranean had weakened, and a new power was rising: Rome. The arrival of the Romans in the Near East would alter the destiny of Israel forever. Under Roman rule, the Holy Land became a crossroads of empire, faith, and rebellion, a place where divine promises, human ambitions, and historical forces collided. The Second Temple, once a symbol of restoration, would face its most dramatic test. The story of Roman rule in Israel begins with internal strife. After the Maccabean revolt and the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, the Jewish kingdom enjoyed a brief period of independence. Yet internal divisions between rival factions, particularly the Pharisees and Sadducees, weakened political unity. When two Hasmonean brothers Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II contested the throne. Both sought Roman support. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey intervened, entering Jerusalem under the pretext of restoring order. What followed was the beginning of Roman domination, subtle at first, but absolute in its consequences. Rome incorporated Judea as a client kingdom, allowing local rulers to govern under imperial oversight. Herod the Great, appointed by Rome as king of the Jews in 37 BCE, epitomized this complex relationship. Herod was a master politician, balancing loyalty to Rome with efforts to legitimize his rule among his subjects. His reign was marked by massive building projects, including the expansion of the Second Temple, transforming it into one of the most magnificent religious structures of the ancient world. The temple's vast courtyards, gleaming white stones, and golden facades became a beacon of worship, a testament to both divine grandeur and human craftsmanship. Yet Herod's reign was also one of paranoia and brutality. He ruled with an iron hand, suppressing dissent and executing rivals, including members of his own family. To many Jews, Herod represented the uneasy compromise between faith and foreign power, a ruler who beautified the temple while serving Rome's interests. The land itself mirrored this duality, outwardly prosperous, yet spiritually restless. The people lived under the shadow of empire, bound by law and tradition, but constrained by political reality. Following Herod's death, Judea was divided among his sons, and eventually, direct Roman governance was imposed. The land of Israel became a Roman province, ruled by governors such as Pontius Pilate, whose administration coincided with growing unrest. Heavy taxation, religious tension, and the presence of foreign troops fueled resentment among the population. The Roman Empire demanded order. The people of the Holy Land demanded freedom and faith. These opposing forces would soon erupt into open conflict. During this period, religious diversity within Judea flourished but also deepened divisions. The Pharisees emphasized adherence to the law and purity of practice. The Sadducees maintained priestly authority centered on the temple. The Essenes withdrew to the wilderness, seeking purity through ascetic life, and groups such as the Zealots began advocating violent resistance against Rome. Each faction represented a different vision of how to live faithfully in a land under occupation. Beneath their differences lay a shared conviction. The land was holy, divinely promised, and no empire could permanently claim it. The 1st century CE was a time of profound expectation. Many Jews believed that deliverance was near, that God would soon restore Israel's independence and usher in a new era of peace and justice. The Holy Land, already sacred through centuries of covenantal history, now became the stage for hopes of divine intervention. It was in this atmosphere of anticipation and unrest that new movements emerged, including one centered around a teacher from Nazareth, Jesus. His message of spiritual renewal, mercy, and divine kingdom resonated deeply with some, while provoking hostility from others. Though his story would extend beyond the confines of Jewish history, it unfolded within the living landscape of the Holy Land, intertwining faith, geography, and destiny. Roman governance, however, was unyielding. The empire tolerated local customs and religions so long as taxes were paid and order maintained. But the spirit of rebellion simmered beneath the surface. The breaking point came in 66 CE, when tensions over taxation, religious insult, and oppression ignited a full-scale revolt. The First Jewish-Roman War was fierce and devastating. Zealot forces captured Jerusalem, expelling Roman garrisons, and for a brief moment, the people of Israel once again ruled their sacred land. But Rome's response was relentless. Under the command of General Vespasian and his son Titus, Roman legions advanced methodically, crushing resistance throughout Galilee and Judea. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE was one of the most harrowing episodes in ancient history. The city, crowded with pilgrims and refugees, suffered starvation, disease, and internal conflict. The defenders, divided among factions, fought with desperate fury. When Roman forces finally breached the walls, they set fire to the temple. Flames consumed the sanctuary, the altar, and the sacred treasures. The Second Temple, the spiritual heart of the Holy Land, was reduced to ruins. Only fragments remained, including the massive retaining wall that still stands today, revered as the Western Wall. The destruction of the temple was not merely a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe. For centuries, the temple had been the axis of faith, the dwelling place of divine presence. Its loss raised profound theological questions. Had God abandoned his people? Was the covenant broken? In response, Jewish leaders and scholars sought new ways to preserve their identity and faith. The focus shifted from temple-centered worship to prayer, study, and communal life, practices that could endure even in exile. The land, though devastated, remained sacred, its memory and meaning embedded in the consciousness of the people. After the war, the Romans imposed harsh punishments. Jerusalem was left in ruins, its population scattered. Its name eventually changed to Aelia Capitolina under Emperor Hadrian, yet the destruction did not sever the bond between the Jewish people and their land. Instead, it transformed the nature of that connection. The Holy Land became a symbol of loss, longing, and hope, a place to which hearts and prayers continually turned. The phrase, "next year in Jerusalem," became not only a ritual expression, but a declaration of enduring faith. In the broader context of history, the Roman period revealed the paradox of the Holy Land. It is a small strip of earth, yet it carries infinite spiritual weight. Empires could conquer it, kings could rule it, and armies could burn its cities, but its holiness endured. The land of Israel became not just a physical homeland, but an eternal ideal, a promise that transcends time and conquest. The fall of the Second Temple also shaped the spiritual landscape of the entire world. Judaism adapted to survive without its sacred center, giving rise to rabbinic traditions and the synagogue as the new locus of worship. Christianity, emerging from the same soil, would spread its message across the Roman world, carrying the memory of Jerusalem into new cultural and theological realms. The Holy Land thus became the heart of global faith, its influence radiating far beyond its borders. In conclusion, the Roman era and the destruction of the Second Temple mark one of the most defining moments in the story of how Israel became the Holy Land. It was an age of grandeur, conflict, and transformation. The land's sanctity was tested by empire, rebellion, and loss. Yet through these trials, its spiritual essence deepened. The temple's fall did not extinguish holiness, it diffused it into hearts, texts, and communities across the world, even amid ruin, the people's devotion to their land remained unbroken. The Holy Land, once again, proved itself not as a possession of kings or conquerors, but as a timeless covenant between God and his people, an eternal landscape of faith, memory, and divine promise. When the smoke cleared over the ruins of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Holy Land had changed forever. The Second Temple was gone, the priesthood scattered, and the city that had stood at the center of Jewish faith lay in desolation. Yet from that desolation arose something extraordinary, a transformation of faith, identity, and memory that would ensure the holiness of Israel would never fade. The physical land had been conquered, but the spiritual geography of the Holy Land now took root in the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. The Roman victory led to one of the most significant dispersions in Jewish history. Entire communities were uprooted and resettled across the Mediterranean world, from North Africa to Asia Minor, from Mesopotamia to the far reaches of Europe. The Holy Land's inhabitants became wanderers, merchants, scholars, and storytellers, carrying with them a deep longing for the hills and valleys of Judea. In every city where they settled, synagogues became new centers of gathering, not as substitutes for the temple, but as echoes of it. Every prayer, every reading of the Torah, every festival carried a memory of Zion, a yearning for the soil where faith had first taken root. This dispersion, known as the diaspora, was not only a geographic reality, but a spiritual reorientation. Without the temple, Judaism evolved into a religion centered on study, law, and communal life. The rabbis, inheritors of both prophetic vision and priestly authority, began codifying traditions to preserve identity in exile. From this effort emerged monumental works such as the Mishnah and later the Talmud, texts that became portable sanctuaries of wisdom and faith. Within them, the Holy Land was not merely remembered, it was studied, described, and sanctified anew. Geography became theology, and longing became a form of worship. Even in exile, the Jewish calendar continued to revolve around the land. Festivals such as Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot were celebrated in distant lands, but always pointed back to Jerusalem. Every Passover meal concluded with the same words, "Next year in Jerusalem." It was not a mere wish, it was a declaration of endurance. The physical temple might have been destroyed, but the spiritual temple, the unbroken bond between people and land, endured in every generation. This collective memory gave meaning to exile, transforming loss into hope and displacement into devotion. Roman rule tightened after the revolt. A second rebellion, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 136 CE, attempted once more to reclaim independence and rebuild Jerusalem. For a time, it seemed successful. Coins were minted, bearing inscriptions proclaiming, "For the freedom of Israel." But Rome's response was merciless. The rebellion was crushed, hundreds of thousands perished, and Jews were banned from Jerusalem. Emperor Hadrian renamed the city Aelia Capitolina and the province itself as Syria Palestina, a name intended to erase Jewish identity from the land. Yet the attempt to sever the people from their homeland only deepened their spiritual connection to it. In exile, the image of the Holy Land grew in power and significance. It became the center of prayer, the direction of hope, and the subject of endless commentary. The rabbis spoke of the land's holiness in layered terms, as a place chosen by God as the dwelling of the Shekinah, the divine presence, and as the ultimate destiny of the Jewish people. In the Talmudic imagination, even the dust of the land had meaning, and burial in its soil was considered a final act of faith. The Holy Land, though far away, remained vividly present in thought, ritual, and word. As centuries passed, Jewish communities adapted to new environments under Roman, Byzantine, Persian, and later Islamic rule. In every setting, the Holy Land remained central to identity. Pilgrimages, when possible, were undertaken by scholars and travelers who documented the sacred sites, recording their impressions of Jerusalem, Hebron, and the Galilee. Even when physical return was impossible, spiritual return was enacted daily through prayer. Facing Jerusalem, Jews across the world oriented their bodies and souls toward the land, reaffirming that holiness was not confined by distance. The diaspora also transformed the way the world perceived the Holy Land. Christian communities, emerging from Jewish roots, came to venerate the same landscapes: Bethlehem, Nazareth, the Mount of Olives, as the settings of their own sacred history. Over time, the Holy Land became a universal symbol of divine presence, central to multiple faiths. Yet for the Jewish people, it remained something deeply personal, a homeland remembered, mourned, and promised. Its hills and valleys lived in the psalms, prayers, and stories told from parent to child across generations. The exile also fostered resilience. Dispersed, yet united by faith, Jews built networks of learning and trade that spanned continents. The memory of Zion gave coherence to a scattered people, anchoring them in history and hope. The idea of return, aliyah, ascent, became a spiritual aspiration. Even as empires rose and fell, the dream of returning to the Holy Land remained unbroken, passed through centuries of longing, persecution, and perseverance. In the medieval period, Jewish poets and mystics deepened the spiritual dimension of the land. In the songs of Yehuda Halevi, for example, we hear the voice of longing. My heart is in the east, and I'm at the edge of the west. The Holy Land was not merely a destination, it was the embodiment of divine intimacy. Mystical traditions, such as Kabbalah, envisioned the land as a reflection of higher worlds, a place where heaven and earth touched. Through these spiritual interpretations, the Holy Land became both physical and metaphysical, a realm of memory, prophecy, and divine mystery. Meanwhile, small Jewish communities continued to exist in the land itself. In cities like Tiberias, Saft, Hebron, and Jerusalem, Jews maintained a presence despite hardship and shifting rulers. These communities served as living witnesses that the covenantal link between the people and their land was never severed. Pilgrims from the diaspora sent funds to sustain them, regarding these residents as the guardians of sacred soil. The land's holiness was not an abstract ideal. It was lived, preserved, and transmitted through devotion. Over time, the Holy Land became a shared symbol of faith for the world's great religions. For Christians, it was the site of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, a landscape of redemption. For Muslims, it was the land of prophets and the location of Al-Aqsa, the place of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. Jerusalem became a meeting point of faiths, each viewing its stones and sanctuaries as reflections of divine purpose. Yet for all its universality, the land's original covenantal meaning as the promise between God and the descendants of Abraham remained at the heart of its sacred identity. The enduring holiness of Israel, even in absence, demonstrates a profound truth. Holiness is not diminished by distance. The people carried their homeland within them, sanctifying new lands with memory and hope. The diaspora turned geography into faith, transforming loss into legacy, exile into endurance. Through centuries of displacement, the Holy Land lived not only on maps, but in minds, prayers, and texts, binding the scattered children of Israel to a single sacred story. In conclusion, the aftermath of the temple's fall and the long centuries of diaspora did not end the holiness of the land. They expanded it. The Holy Land became a living idea, a place of longing, study, and sanctity that transcended time and distance. Its soil was remembered in song, its hills in prayer, its promise in hope. The people may have been scattered to the corners of the earth, but the bond between them and their land remained eternal. The Holy Land, now preserved in the heart of every believer, became both a memory of the past and a vision of the future, waiting, as always, to be restored. When Christianity took shape in the first century CE, it did not begin as a distant idea. It was born from the soil of Israel itself. Every scene in the early Christian story unfolded against the backdrop of Judea and Galilee, regions already layered with centuries of prophecy, pilgrimage, and expectation. For followers of Jesus, this landscape became the living text through which divine truth was revealed. In time, it would be sanctified not only by memory, but by millions of footsteps, prayers, and tears. The Gospels record that Jesus walked the narrow roads of Capernaum, prayed on the Mount of Olives, and taught by the waters of the Sea of Galilee. These familiar landscapes of first century Palestine became the spiritual cartography of a new religion. The early believers regarded each location as a tangible witness to the events that changed human history. Bethlehem symbolized the humility of divine birth. The Jordan River marked the moment of spiritual rebirth. The hills of Jerusalem became the setting of sacrifice and resurrection. Through these places, geography itself became theology. The land told the story of salvation. In the first generations after the crucifixion, Christianity remained a movement within Judaism. Its earliest followers continued to pray in the temple courts and to honor the festivals of the Jewish calendar. Yet as persecution and dispersal followed the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, Christian communities spread throughout the Mediterranean. Wherever they went, they carried an unshakable reverence for the homeland of their faith. Letters circulated describing the holy places, preserving detailed memories of locations tied to the life of Jesus. For Christians living far from Judea, the Holy Land represented the concrete evidence of a spiritual promise. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian pilgrims began making their way to the land of the Gospels. These early travelers often faced perilous journeys, but the desire to see the places mentioned in Scripture outweighed any danger. The accounts they left behind, notably that of the pilgrim Exile in the 4th century, offered vivid descriptions of sacred sites and the growing network of churches and monasteries that dotted the landscape. Each structure represented an act of commemoration, a transformation of ordinary terrain into a living memorial of divine events. The conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century marked a new epoch. Christianity, once persecuted, became the favored religion of the empire, and the Holy Land turned from a remote province into the spiritual capital of the Christian world. Constantine's mother, Helena, journeyed to Judea on what became the most famous pilgrimage in history. Guided by local Christians, she sought the exact sites of Christ's passion and resurrection. Her discoveries led to the founding of magnificent churches: the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Church of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives, and above all, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. When the church was completed in 335 CE, it symbolized not only the triumph of Christianity, but the sanctification of the land itself. Under Byzantine rule, the 4th through 6th centuries witnessed an unprecedented wave of construction. Shrines, monasteries, and hermitages spread across Judea's hills and the deserts of the Jordan Valley. Monasticism flourished as men and women withdrew to the wilderness to seek spiritual purity in the same landscape where prophets had once heard the voice of God. Figures such as Saint Sabas and Saint Gerasemus established great monastic communities that turned the barren land into a theater of prayer. The arid cliffs around the Dead Sea echoed with psalms. The caves of the Judean desert became new temples of devotion. Pilgrimage became central to Christian life. From distant provinces, Gaul, Egypt, Armenia, and beyond, pilgrims set out for Jerusalem, carrying relics and returning home with flasks of Jordan water or fragments of olive wood. The journey itself was seen as a form of penance and transformation, mirroring the spiritual path from sin to redemption. The Holy Land thus became a bridge between heaven and earth, a physical space through which believers could encounter the divine narrative directly. Yet this sanctification did not erase the land's earlier layers of meaning. Jewish and Samaritan communities still lived in Palestine, maintaining their own sacred traditions and synagogues. The coexistence of these groups, sometimes tense, sometimes peaceful, ensured that the Holy Land remained a mosaic of faiths. Even as Christianity proclaimed a new covenant, the presence of ancient rituals and Hebrew prayers reminded pilgrims that holiness here was ancient and multifaceted. Jerusalem itself underwent a transformation so profound that it reshaped the imagination of the Christian world. Once a city of ruins, it became the New Jerusalem, a symbol of the heavenly city described in the book of Revelation. Processions traced the Via Dolorosa, marking the stages of Christ's Passion. Easter celebrations drew thousands of worshippers who filled the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with chants and incense. The city's gates and streets became living scriptures. Every stone was a testament. The sanctification of the land also redefined time. Liturgical calendars began to revolve around the events commemorated in Jerusalem. Feasts such as Christmas, Epiphany, and Easter gained new depth as believers could associate them with exact places. The land turned the abstract into the tangible. Bethlehem made the nativity real. Golgotha made sacrifice visible. And the empty tomb confirmed the promise of resurrection. For countless Christians who would never see these sights in person, the descriptions of pilgrims and clergy transported them there in imagination and faith. By the 6th century, the Holy Land was no longer merely a provincial region. It was the spiritual center of an empire stretching across 3 continents. Maps and mosaics, such as the famous one at Madaba in modern Jordan, depicted its towns and roads with exquisite detail, evidence of how central the geography had become to Christian consciousness. Monks copied manuscripts in Latin, Greek, Syriac, and Coptic, preserving both scripture and the geography that anchored it. The land of Israel had become the crossroads of devotion, scholarship, and empire. This Christian sanctification of the Holy Land did not diminish its Jewish roots. Rather, it layered new meanings atop the old. The prophet's homeland had become the place where divine prophecy was fulfilled, and in turn, it inspired new waves of prophecy, mysticism, and art, from cathedrals in Rome to monasteries in Ireland. The imagery of Jerusalem, its walls, its temple, its golden light, shaped architecture and imagination. To the medieval mind, to long for heaven was to long for Jerusalem. Through these centuries, the Holy Land was no longer a single people's inheritance, but a shared spiritual axis for humanity. Yet even in its universality, it retained its singular mystery. The same hills where Abraham once wandered now carried the memories of apostles. The same deserts that heard the voices of prophets now echoed with the hymns of monks. Every generation added new layers of sanctity, proving that holiness, once born, multiplies rather than fades. By the eve of the 7th century, when new powers would soon rise from Arabia and reshape the region again, the Christian Holy Land stood as a mosaic of faith, memory, and aspiration, a realm where history and eternity touched. From this soil, sanctified by countless acts of belief, the world's idea of sacred space had taken its most enduring form. By the early 7th century, the Holy Land had endured centuries of conquest, exile, and religious transformation. Roman and Byzantine rule had left Jerusalem and surrounding regions steeped in Christian culture, pilgrimage networks, and monumental architecture. Yet, a new power was rising in the Arabian Peninsula, a movement that would reshape the Middle East, bring political stability, and add a third layer of spiritual significance to the land of Israel. Islam emerged not as a foreign conqueror in the purely military sense, but as a faith and polity whose expansion would enshrine the Holy Land as sacred within its religious imagination. The rapid expansion of Islamic rule in the 7th century brought Syria, Palestine, and Jerusalem under the control of the Rashidun Caliphate. By 638 CE, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab entered Jerusalem peacefully, following a negotiated surrender with the Christian patriarch Sophronius. This transition marked a profound moment. Rather than destroying existing sacred sites, the new rulers recognized and protected the spiritual landmarks of Jews and Christians, while establishing their own presence. The Holy Land was now consecrated anew, not through conquest alone, but through administration, recognition, and the integration of the land into a broader religious and political framework. Islam's connection to the Holy Land centers on the city of Jerusalem, known in Arabic as Al-Quds, the Holy. Its sanctity is derived from multiple historical and theological traditions. According to early Islamic narratives, Jerusalem is associated with the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension, Isra and Miraj, in which Muhammad was transported from Mecca to Jerusalem and ascended to the heavens. This event imbued the city with profound spiritual significance, positioning it as the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. In this way, the land became a sacred nexus, linking multiple traditions, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic, each contributing layers of meaning to its geography. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 CE by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, stands as the architectural and symbolic centerpiece of this sanctification. Situated on the Temple Mount, the site of the former Jewish temples, the Dome of the Rock was not constructed as a mosque in the early sense, but as a monumental shrine. Its golden dome, intricate mosaics, and inscriptions proclaiming the oneness of God symbolized a new religious order while acknowledging the land's layered history. The structure visually and spiritually tied Islam to the land, asserting continuity with Abrahamic heritage while marking the Holy Land as central to the Islamic worldview. Under Islamic rule, Jerusalem became a hub of administration, scholarship, and pilgrimage. Muslim governors, or emirs, oversaw the city's security and the maintenance of its sacred sites. Roads, markets, and water systems were restored, ensuring that the urban and rural landscape remained functional and thriving. This period demonstrated a distinctive approach to sanctity. The land's holiness was not only theological, but also civic. Governance, care for sacred architecture, and the protection of inhabitants were considered extensions of divine stewardship. The Holy Land, in Islamic imagination, required both reverence and responsible management. Beyond Jerusalem, other regions of the land acquired additional Islamic significance. Hebron, associated with Abraham, became a pilgrimage site under the caliphs, reflecting the continuity of biblical tradition. The landscapes of Galilee and the Jordan Valley retained practical and symbolic importance as early Muslim scholars, travelers, and geographers described these regions in ways that integrated both sacred memory and contemporary administration. Maps produced during the Umayyad and Abbasid periods show a detailed awareness of sites linked to earlier prophets, illustrating that sanctity was a cumulative quality, layered across time, remembered, and reinterpreted. Islamic rule also introduced new cultural practices that reshaped the spiritual experience of the land. Friday prayers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built adjacent to the Dome of the Rock, became central to religious life, attracting the worshippers from across the region. The city became a site of theological learning where scholars studied Quranic exegesis, hadith, and legal jurisprudence. Monuments, inscriptions, and Waqf endowments reinforced the idea that the land itself was consecrated through human devotion and care. Sanctity was no longer merely inherited. It was actively cultivated through scholarship, architecture, and ritual. The coexistence of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities in the early centuries of Islamic rule further underscored the layered holiness of the land. Protected status was granted to people of the book, Jews and Christians, who were allowed to maintain places of worship and continue pilgrimage practices under dhimmi arrangements. The Holy Land thus became a mosaic of faiths, each contributing to its spiritual resonance. Sacred soil was shared, revered, and carefully managed, demonstrating that holiness could encompass multiple traditions without being extinguished. Islamic scholarship also engaged deeply with the history of the land. Early geographers, historians, and theologians chronicled its sacred sites, often referencing the biblical and Christian narratives, while framing them within Islamic theology. Works such as the writings of al-Muqaddasi and later travelogues of Ibn Jubair and al-Idrisi document Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, and the Galilee with precision, intertwining history, geography, and religious reflection. The Holy Land was understood as both a repository of memory and a living landscape, sanctified through narrative, devotion, and continuous human presence. The impact of Islamic rule on the Holy Land persisted through centuries of political change. Following the Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, Crusaders, and Mamluks, the land continued to serve as a spiritual and political nexus. Each regime contributed to the maintenance, expansion, or reinterpretation of sacred sites. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque remained central, while churches, synagogues, and other landmarks continued to coexist. The sanctity of the land was thus cumulative, a palimpsest of faith that absorbed, remembered, and integrated multiple religious identities. In conclusion, the arrival of Islam introduced a third layer of sacred significance to the Holy Land. Jerusalem became a focal point for devotion, scholarship, and governance, while the broader landscapes of Judea and Galilee were incorporated into a spiritual and administrative framework that ensured the land's sanctity endured. Islamic architecture, jurisprudence, and pilgrimage practices reinforced the idea that holiness was both inherited and enacted, maintained through human care and remembrance. The land, already central to Jewish and Christian faith, was now sanctified anew, forming a spiritual bridge between Abrahamic traditions. The Holy Land, under Islam, demonstrates that sacred geography is not static. It is continuously shaped by the people who inhabit it, the rulers who administer it, and the narratives that define it. The land of Israel, layered with millennia of memory, prophecy, and devotion, remained central to faith, identity, and imagination. Each conquest, each transformation, each act of care reaffirmed that its holiness is resilient, complex, and eternal. The Holy Land entered a new chapter in 1095 with the call of Pope Urban II, sparking the Crusades, a series of military campaigns aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem for Christendom. Pilgrims had long traveled to the city, but increasing tensions between Byzantine rulers and expanding Islamic empires created political openings. European knights arrived in waves, motivated by religious fervor, promises of land, and personal glory. Jerusalem became a prize not only of faith, but of power. The Crusaders captured the city in 1099, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Churches, fortifications, and monastic orders were constructed to secure both worship and military dominance. Yet the campaigns brought widespread violence, displacing Muslim and Jewish populations and reshaping the city's demographics. Over the next 2 centuries, Jerusalem changed hands multiple times, illustrating the persistent convergence of faith, politics, and geography in the land. The Crusades demonstrated that holiness could be a catalyst for both devotion and conflict, leaving lasting legacies in memory, architecture, and interfaith relations. By the mid-13th century, the Mamluks, a military caste originating in Egypt, rose to power and assumed control over the Holy Land. Unlike the Crusaders, they focused on governance and preservation. They restored mosques, shrines, and urban infrastructure while maintaining order among diverse religious communities. Trade routes were reopened, pilgrimages encouraged, and taxation systems standardized. Although military campaigns against remaining Crusader strongholds were frequent, the Mamluks recognized the importance of the land's sacred character. Their architectural contributions, including fortresses and caravanserais, reinforced both the practical and symbolic dimensions of the Holy Land. They preserved the region's sanctity by stabilizing governance and ensuring that religious life could continue, illustrating how political control could coexist with spiritual respect. Under their administration, the Holy Land became more than a battlefield. It was a functioning hub of devotion, commerce, and cultural transmission. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire absorbed the Holy Land into its vast territories, initiating 4 centuries of relative stability. The Ottomans integrated Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, and other sacred cities into a unified provincial administration. Religious communities retained autonomy under the millet system, allowing Jews, Christians, and Muslims to manage internal affairs. The Ottomans invested in infrastructure, restoring city walls, markets, and aqueducts, and constructed new mosques and public buildings. Pilgrimages flourished as roads were maintained and caravan routes secured. Ottoman governors balanced imperial interests with local religious sensitivities, ensuring that the sanctity of sites like the Temple Mount, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Al-Aqsa Mosque was preserved. The empire's long rule stabilized the land's political landscape while reinforcing its spiritual and cultural significance. The Holy Land, once again, became a place where faith, memory, and governance intertwined harmoniously. The 19th century saw the Holy Land re-emerge on the global stage as European powers expressed renewed interest in its politics, archaeology, and spiritual significance. Christian missionaries, scholars, and diplomats traveled to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, often sponsored by Britain, France, and Russia. Archaeological expeditions uncovered ancient sites connecting biblical narratives to tangible geography, while European governments negotiated protective rights for Christian minorities. This era also saw the rise of new infrastructure. Roads, telegraphs, and railways connected cities and facilitated travel, making pilgrimage more accessible. The Holy Land became a symbolic prize in international diplomacy, with powers asserting influence under the guise of religious stewardship. These developments reinforced the land's dual identity, both sacred and geopolitical. While Europeans marveled at its spiritual and historical layers, local communities navigated foreign presence, balancing tradition with the pressures of modernization and external politics. The 19th century thus transformed the Holy Land into a global crossroads of devotion, scholarship, and imperial interest. The late 19th and early 20th centuries introduced a new movement that would permanently alter the relationship between the Jewish people and the land: Zionism. Spurred by centuries of exile, persecution, and cultural revival, Jewish leaders and intellectuals envisioned the return to their ancestral homeland as both a national and spiritual imperative. Political Zionism, led by figures such as Theodor Herzl, encouraged organized settlement, agricultural development, and the creation of communal institutions. Jewish immigration increased, particularly from Eastern Europe, leading to the establishment of kibbutzim, towns, and urban neighborhoods. The Holy Land, once remembered primarily in prayer and memory, became a tangible place of rebuilding and renewal. Zionist efforts emphasized both historical connection and contemporary development, blending ancient sanctity with modern aspirations. This period marked a profound shift. The land's holiness was now intertwined with the possibility of self-determination and physical return, linking centuries of spiritual longing to practical action. Following World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations placed Palestine under British mandate in 1920. The Mandate period profoundly reshaped the Holy Land's political and social landscape. Britain facilitated Jewish immigration under the Balfour Declaration while also balancing the interests of Arab communities, creating complex tensions over governance, land ownership, and cultural identity. Cities like Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa expanded with new administrative buildings, roads, and railways connecting the region. Pilgrimage continued, but political awareness now accompanied spiritual devotion. Both Jewish and Arab populations asserted historical and religious claims, often clashing as national identities crystallized. The Holy Land was no longer only a sacred space. It became a contested political landscape, reflecting the interplay between faith, modern nationalism, and international diplomacy. British governance, while stabilizing infrastructure, inadvertently set the stage for the geopolitical struggles that would dominate the 20th century. The mid-20th century brought the most dramatic transformation in the Holy Land's modern history, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, following decades of Jewish immigration under Ottoman and British rule. Combined with the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, the United Nations proposed a partition plan dividing the land between Jewish and Arab states. The plan's adoption triggered immediate conflict. Neighboring Arab nations invaded, leading to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Israel's victory established sovereign control over much of its historic homeland, while large populations of Palestinians were displaced, beginning a prolonged refugee crisis. Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the land, was divided, with West Jerusalem under Israeli control and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, controlled by Jordan. The creation of Israel fused modern statehood with ancient holiness. The land became both a national home and a global symbol of faith and history. Yet this new reality also intensified conflicts as religious, historical, and political claims intertwined in ways that continue to reverberate today. Despite ongoing conflict, the sanctity of the Holy Land remains preserved through both intentional conservation and spiritual devotion. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities continue to maintain ancient shrines, mosques, churches, and synagogues. Sites such as the Western Wall, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Al-Aqsa Mosque draw millions of pilgrims and tourists annually, reflecting the land's ongoing religious magnetism. Preservation efforts include archaeological research, restoration projects, and international cooperation to protect historic structures from decay or destruction. Interfaith dialogue initiatives also emphasize coexistence, recognizing the shared spiritual significance of these spaces. The Holy Land demonstrates that sanctity can endure even amidst political tension, and that devotion, scholarship, and practical care are essential to maintaining its sacred character. Its ongoing preservation is a living testament to resilience, memory, and faith spanning millennia. Today, the Holy Land exists as both a modern, populated region and an enduring spiritual symbol. Israel and the Palestinian territories host vibrant communities, cities, and agricultural landscapes, while retaining the historic and sacred sites that draw pilgrims worldwide. Education, archaeology, and cultural programming connect contemporary residents and visitors with centuries of layered history. Religions continue to interpret and interact with the land, creating a dynamic relationship between past and present. Festivals, rituals, and pilgrimages maintain the sacred rhythms established millennia ago. The land's cultural, spiritual, and historical resonance extends far beyond its borders, influencing art, literature, theology, and international diplomacy. Its story is one of survival, transformation, and sacred continuity, a land repeatedly sanctified, contested, remembered, and cherished. The Holy Land today is a mosaic of faiths, memories, and aspirations, a place where history, devotion, and human endeavor converge. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of how Israel became the Holy Land, a land where faith, history, and humanity intertwine. Let your mind rest on the echoes of ancient prayers and desert winds. Sleep well, dear friend. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.